Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about the transition from undergrad to law school, which it turns out is kind of a big one. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess, that's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Conference. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Before we get started, I want to take a minute and share some exciting news. We are thrilled to announce the Start Law School Right contest. The contest, launching in April 2017, will offer entrants the chance to win a Start Law School Right Silver course package valued at $485. To learn more about how to enter and official contest rules, please visit our Facebook page /Law School Toolbox or our course page at lawschooltoolbox.com/courses/join. If you missed the contest, we hope you will check out our Start Law School Right course to see if it would be a good fit for you. Welcome back. Today we're talking about making the transition from undergrad to law school. If you are a prospective law student, this episode is for you. For everyone else, it is important to recognize how law school is different so you can adjust your habits accordingly. Today's special guest is Keri Clapp, one of our law school and bar exam tutors at the Law School Toolbox. Keri also currently teaches business law at Eastern University in Pennsylvania and law school classes at Widener University, Delaware Law School. Keri, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Lee.
So what I think makes your perspective on this topic so unique and why I wanted to bring you on is because you work with both of these populations simultaneously, undergrads and law students. So before we dive too deeply into this topic, why don't you just share a bit with our listeners how you ended up kind of teaching both of these student populations?
Well, I was one of the students that actually loved law school, and some of us don't, but I was always interested in legal education. And so after I'd spent some time in private and government practice, I started exploring where I could teach and use those skills. So the first course that I took on as an instructor was teaching an academic support course, which was a course in law school designed to help shore up the skills of some of the students who had done okay first semester, but not great. And shortly after that, I took on an undergraduate class. So there I had two populations, one slightly before the other, and it really showed me what they had in common and what the challenges were in moving from one to the other.
And so what do you think are the main differences between undergraduate classes and law school classes? I mean, probably the most obvious one is just the format, the Socratic method versus kind of, I guess, what would you call the undergrad method, just a lecture-based teaching style?
I think at the upper level, a lot of students have experience with seminars where there is a lot of interaction with their professor. But in general, I think the goal in an undergraduate class is usually pretty specific. They want you to master a topic or a subject area or an industry and be able to discuss it intelligently and see what the positives are and what the challenges are. I teach mostly business students, so the class that I teach tends to be a survey of the legal environment of business. In contrast, whatever subject you're asked to learn in law school, you're also expected to learn like a lawyer and learn how to think about the subject like a lawyer. And that's different for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think every new law student hears that term. You need to think like a lawyer, and nobody's really sure what it means.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting. When I look at undergraduate textbooks and when I choose the textbooks that I use for my classes, there are a lot of options out there that are very user-friendly in undergrad courses. They have definitions, they have objectives, they have review questions, they're very visual, they're nice to look at, nice to flip through. They're sort of a combination of what old college textbooks used to be and picture books in ways to really reach a wide variety of learners. And in contrast, the typical casebook that you get in law school looks pretty much the same as it did 50 years ago. It's a big, thick book, and its primary goal is to confuse you at first, and that's on purpose.
Right, with tiny type and very thin pages.
Exactly.
So you feel like you are the slowest reader in the entire world because it takes so long to get through page after page.
Well, I distinctly remember getting an assignment to read 30 pages in my first week of law school and thinking, this is great. It's a very manageable amount. I'm a good reader. I'm a fast reader. I'll get this. And I struggled for several hours to understand what those 30 pages were talking about. And that's the point.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I wasn't failing to do what I was supposed to do. Struggling with the material and not understanding it was exactly what I was supposed to be doing. But I didn't realize that at the time.
I think we often say the rule of thumb is about like 10 pages an hour. And I think that's a sobering fact for a lot of 1Ls to realize that 30-page reading assignment can take multiple hours, up to like 3 hours, depending on how dense the material is.
Yeah. And sometimes I think both in class and in textbooks, the purpose is to get you confused so that you see whatever topic or issue you're discussing or learning about from so many different sides that you start to feel like you're in the weeds and you can't figure it out. And then you gradually start pulling the threads and putting that together. I've mixed my metaphors here, I'm sure.
That's okay. I think we follow. I had a professor who wrote our criminal law textbook, and he didn't produce a syllabus for the class. And so, it's our first day of 1L year, and somebody raises their hand and says, well, what's the reading assignment? And he goes, well, I think the editor of your casebook really has a good plan of how this stuff should be taught. So read 40-some pages a week. And we were just kind of like, okay.
Yeah.
That's it. We just read, and it's the only casebook in my entirety of law school. I read the entire casebook because he basically you had to read every single page, but it was kind of fascinating because usually you get this complicated syllabus and you're reading a case here and a case there, and most professors don't have time to go through an entire casebook, but he had built this casebook for his class, and he's like, just read the casebook.
Well, we'll
talk about it as it comes
You got
up.
your money's worth out of that casebook.
I did. I've actually kept it. I can see it. It's sitting on my bookshelf. I've kept it, even though it's terribly outdated, just because I feel so much pride that I read the whole thing. Start to finish, highlighted, notes in the margins. So we've talked a bit about the reading. Do you think, these assignments are, as we said, challenging and dense, and just outside of the difference in the casebooks, which I think is a fabulous distinction, the law professors are really kind of tasked with giving you challenging assignments. If you don't think what you're doing is hard, then you may not be doing it correctly. Don't you think?
I do. And I've seen a lot of students that did really well with a certain skill set in college. And many of those skills are transferable to law school, but sometimes they have to look at those skills in a new way and get the new skills that they need. So for instance, some really bright students that haven't dealt with a lot of ambiguity, they may be engineering majors or math majors. It takes them a while to understand that no matter how much they work on something by themselves, it may not click until they sit through that class, hear the professor question their classmates, challenge what their classmates say, and sort of take them through a series of cases that at the end they understand all the issues that are involved, but they can't do it on their own. So they don't sit in class and think, I prepared, I'm in great shape. They sit in class and think, I prepared, why am I still confused? When that's exactly what they're supposed to be feeling. Yeah.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And when I think about the difference between even my memory of my undergrad exams versus my law school exams, my undergrad classes were so much more about understanding the material. You might get a question that asks, what was Marbury versus Madison, and, what did it lay out as far as the rules or the approach for judicial review. But in law school, you may see that on a question, but you're likely not going to. You're likely going to just see a fact pattern And maybe you have to mention Marbury versus Madison because it sets the precedent for judicial review. And so it's a very different format because it's all about that analysis. You have to memorize stuff too, but it's about thinking like a lawyer, which I kind of think the analysis is really the biggest piece of that thinking like a lawyer like phrase for new law students.
Yes, I agree. I think that, a key too is you're asked to learn, say, 10 topics in an undergrad class. And if you learn and understand those 10 topics, you may be able to do very well on an assessment. But in law school, you have to learn and understand and know those 10 topics, but then you have to be able to be flexible with them. So somebody throws you a situation that doesn't really fit cleanly into any category, and you have to take those things that you learned and use them like tools to make an argument how a problem can be solved. So from the very beginning of really good law school classes, they're trying to say, you're going to deal with some hard problems as a lawyer, and our job is to help you figure out how to take all this stuff you're learning and use it as a tool to solve a problem for a real person. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. You were mentioning especially math majors and sometimes science majors and engineering who are really used to having one right answer. I had friends in law school, though, who especially were science majors, who were quite good at law school because they were used to memorizing a ton of information. I remember one of my friends had been pre-med for a while, and so I was complaining about the volume of memorizing, and she goes, well, you never took OChem.
True.
And I'm like, fair point. She's like, I had to learn the best way to do a lot of rote memorization. And I think a lot of us liberal arts majors, I was a psychology and media studies major, skipped that part of a lot of our classes.
And because some of us are not good at memorizing things. We have to really struggle to memorize.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, I think some of the science majors do better with the legal writing piece than some of the students that have done more thesis writing in college. Because I get a lot of students in the first semester of law school that are very good writers if you ask them to write an opinion piece on something. But they don't write in the organizational format that law school and lawyers expect them to write in. And students that have done less writing, so they're grateful when we give them a rubric and say, here, follow this formula. Or students that come from a more science background that are used to following a scientific method, they adopt the sort of legal rubric of CREAC or IRAC very quickly, and they use it, and they're successful.
Yeah.
And some of my best writers have struggled against, well, I don't want to write that way. I like to write this way, and this has been successful, and this sounds better. Well, it may sound better in one context, but it's not what you're expected to do in a time-pressured exam.
True. Yeah. English majors and history majors, I have found, sometimes philosophy too, struggle with that because so much of their undergraduate experience was about crafting language, which there's a time and a place for crafting legal language, but it's usually not on a timed exam.
Yeah. And the good news is I think once they relax into the structure that's expected of them, they're very successful with their writing because they know how to write to persuade or write to convince. So their skills are better. They just have to fit them into a new box.
I think that's true. I like to think about it as writing in this IRAC format or the CREAC format, writing with using all of these terms of art that you learn in law school. It's almost like learning how to write in a bit of a foreign language. It's going to feel awkward to you when you do it. And anytime you study like a foreign language, I'll be honest, my foreign language skills are not wonderful, but I didn't exactly sound like myself when I talk, when I would study Spanish, when I would talk in Spanish, because it was very calculated for a while until you kind of get comfortable with it, and your personality and your comfort level will make that language sound like your own. And I think with legal writing, it's the same thing. You have to really kind of abandon some of these signature things about your writing and how you like things to sound until you understand the basics of the language necessary, and then it will start to sound like you. I remember going back and reading some of my 1L papers that got very good marks, but that didn't sound like me at all. But my, more scholarly type papers that I was writing for my seminars at the end, they definitely did. Then I had absorbed that legal terminology and that legal format into my own being, and then it started to sound like me. And now I'm sure it's completely indistinguishable.
Yeah, well, because now you sound like a lawyer.
Right. Well, thank goodness. Even after all these years.
Even if you don't want to, but you do. Yes.
Right. Right. And just ask everyone in our world, right, who has to hear somebody who tries to tell us, please don't talk to me like you're in your lawyer voice, I think is the request.
Yeah.
So I guess the biggest challenge I would give to maybe an undergrad as they start law school is to come into it with an open mind, that you're going to have to be willing to abandon some of these, I wouldn't necessarily say abandon your writing skills, but abandon some of the, nuances that you may have come to appreciate and enjoy to craft your writing, and take a step back until you learn legal writing, and then you can insert that stuff back in.
Yeah, I think you don't abandon your skills, but you might have to set aside your style.
Style. See, that was the word.
Is like it's almost technical writing at the beginning. Your reader is looking for very specific things in very specific places, and the easier you make it for your reader to find that, the more successful your feedback is.
Right. And you've taught legal writing, and I remember from my legal writing 1L class when I tried to get creative with the organization and creative, thinking I had the most amazing way to approach a problem, my grades, well, they were creative. They weren't, they had a lot of creativity to them, but they weren't what I wanted them to be, I guess. But when I approached my second semester with this idea of what is the fact pattern calling for? What is the law telling me what to do? I remember actually trying to mimic the style and the organization I was seeing in the cases that I was referencing. When I was thinking about what my professor was asking of us, all of a sudden my scores really started to go up. And I think that was because I realized that there was time for creativity, but it was not in 1L legal writing.
Well, and I tell students in 1L legal writing that it all fits together, that they, as they're doing all this case reading, we talked about how much time they spend reading cases. And if they look at the way a good case opinion is written, they will see exactly what I'm trying to teach them in a 1L legal methods class. They will see where the facts go, where the law goes, where the argument and the counter argument fits in. They'll see that it's done in a very predictable format and the creativity is in those paragraphs, but you know where to find each piece of that opinion. And it's the same skills. I think the same skill is transferable to sitting and taking an exam and to the papers that they do in legal methods.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. I think one of the things that you also have to appreciate when you come into your first year of law school is that this is a craft. This is a professional school. Legal writing is a craft. People who take it very seriously take it very seriously. And I was just talking about this on our last podcast recording, so I'm sorry if anyone was listening to that one, but I'm reading Ruth Bader Ginsburg's book I think it's in My Own Words or My Own Words, where it's a compilation of her writing and her speeches, and she's talking about the efforts they go through to craft these opinions. That they write and then they take the dissenting opinions into account, and then they edit it again, and then they talk to somebody else and they edit again. And it's just always such a good reminder to me that the people who are at the highest level are still working on their craft. And she talks about the different styles the judges have, the ones who write in a very succinct way, choose each word carefully, versus, judges or justices who might be more verbose. And it always just sits with me that, at the beginning of your legal career, you may get so caught up in reading these cases and, getting your work done. But I think it's always nice to take that step back and remember that you are learning this craft that even those who are at the end of their career or at the top of their game are still doing as well. This is not easy stuff. Well,
and that's one thing I often tell students if they're thinking about law school and they have time and they want to do something that they might find enjoyable, but also will give them a sense of perspective. There's books out. The Brethren is an old book by Bob Woodward. The Nine, Jeffrey Toobin. They talk about exactly that, how the Supreme Court crafts their opinions, how they work together to come to opinions. And trust me, you don't have time to read those books once you're actually in law school. So if you can get
True.
at least a little glimpse of what happens there, it does help you look at the cases that you're reading when you're doing it as a law student with a different eye.
It's true. It's very, very true. So just starting to absorb, because one of the things that you're doing by reading all of these cases in your case books is to absorb the way that this legal analysis is done. I mean, and every case you read is part of your education in legal writing.
Well, and athletes, I think I sometimes use that analogy both to teach them about using counter argument and thinking it as defense to an offense, and how a good team has both components, but also how most athletes will do repetitive tasks over and over to develop a sort of muscle memory, so that when they're under a time pressure, they don't have to think what goes first. They've done it enough that they've internalized it, and it's become sort of muscle memory for them.
Right. I think that that's a really great analogy. And that is so important, because I think one of the other differences between undergrad and law school is often that your entire grade, or almost the entire grade, is based on one exam at the end of the year. Some schools have midterms. It depends on your law school, but even those midterms are often like 10%. I mean, they don't really have a lot of weight on your grade. It's really all about the end game. And I think that that's really different. I remember maybe a class here or there who had a final paper, and that was basically your grade. But usually there was participation and maybe a project. There were a lot of different opportunities to collect points. And that's just not the deal in law school. It's blind grading. Sit down in a room, 3 to 4 hours, show what you know, show that you can think like a lawyer, and then hope it goes well.
Right, exactly. And a lot of schools are trying to find ways to give students a chance to assess their work, either with the help of the professor or on their own throughout the semester. Mm-hmm. But the point of that is to help the students figure out what they need to do. It's not to give them a strong component of their grade, as you were saying. I have a student now who's been offered an optional midterm where they are given a question. They have the opportunity, if they want, to work it out, to write it up, and then the professor will devote a class to talking about how he would assess that. Some students are going to do that, but even the ones that do it's not taking weight off their final exam. Yeah,
I think, and if you are listening to this and you have an optional midterm, you should definitely do it. Do it. It's totally worth it. Yeah, I think it's great that more law professors are doing that work. And to be honest, that's what a lot of the work we do with our private tutoring students is. We supply them with practice writing and give them feedback throughout the semester, so by the time they get to the exam, it's not the first time they're writing out one of these essay exam answers, or the first time that they're getting feedback from someone other than themselves or a peer, because it is very challenging to know if you're doing it right in the beginning.
Right. And for many students, it's not that they're not capable of learning any particular topic on their own. It's that next step of, now how do I turn that into a tool along with the 100 other tools that I've learned in this class to solve problems. Right. And that's one of the things that we help them practice doing, so that when they do it for real, they're better at it. Right.
So maybe the last big difference, I think, between undergrad and law school is just the workload. I mean, I thought I was busy in undergrad, and I was. I had a lot going on. I had 2 majors. I ran an a cappella group. I had a social life. I was busy. I was up late. But I think the workload in law school is very job-like. I mean, you are working, if you treat it like a job, you are working, a solid number of hours a week and a good chunk of time on the weekends. And it is pretty consuming with all you have to do.
Yes, definitely. And if you are lucky, you are surrounded by people that are doing that as well and that are supporting you and you're enjoying the process. Some people enjoy the process of learning all these great top things. Some people don't. And some people have regular paying jobs at the same time that they're going to law school and taking courses. And then I would definitely say for those people, it's a second full-time job.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Another thing that's interesting, I think Allison and I have mentioned this in one of our podcasts about choosing your law school, is if you are getting decision letters now, which it's about that time of year, and you're trying to pick between law schools, if you're coming directly from undergrad, it is important to think about whether or not you're joining a campus where it is mostly a commuter campus. Like you said, people maybe live far away from school. They might have a job and be going to school. That may be a very different community for you than the undergraduate campus that you were used to, where maybe everybody lives on campus or near campus and you're surrounded by your peers all the time. And so I think that's kind of something that a lot of people don't think about, that different law schools really have different feelings. Or there's a law school in San Francisco that's in a neighborhood where it's not particularly easy to find housing. So even though most people come to the city, they're spread out all over town because it's hard to live right next to school. So it also has a different feel. And I think some folks going straight through can feel a little bit of a sense of that loss of community that you might have had in undergrad as well.
And I think that's probably increasingly the case as students take time off in between.
Oh, I think that's true. Yeah, because you have a lot of people who come to law school with lives fully set up, or even significant others or spouses, living situations, kids, dogs, life responsibilities that are going to have to be balanced with the requirements of law school.
Right.
So what do you think are some of the misconceptions that you hear from your undergraduates about the law school experience?
I think that they run the gamut between students that assume that because they like arguing or they like reading about legal topics, that means they will enjoy law school and want to actually be a lawyer. I think that's one of the misconceptions. And so I always encourage people to take different opportunities to see what lawyers do and see if that is appeals to what they want to do. And I think another misconception is thinking that the skill set that they had in college, because they're a good student in college, they will automatically be a good student in whatever graduate school, including law school, they choose to pursue. And I'm not sure that that's the case. I certainly don't think I would have been a successful med student. I was a very good student, and nobody would have discouraged me from going to medical school. But having seen people go through it, I think I would have struggled with some of the demands and some of the skill sets that just weren't strengths of mine.
And the people who choose to go to graduate school, almost all of them are good students who have an interest or some skills that relate to what they're pursuing.
Right.
So pretty much everyone in your law school class is going to have gotten pretty good grades in undergrad, have writing skills, probably did some extracurriculars, and that's your whole class. And you're going to be curved against that whole class of population that did pretty well in undergrad. So I think it's a different playing field that can be sobering too. Just because you were successful at your university, you are going to walk into your law school seminar and almost everybody in there was pretty successful at university.
Right. And I actually encourage students, if they're serious about law school, to go sit in on a class at a couple of different law schools to get a sense for what the conversation is, what the vibe seems to be between the students and the professors, to get something other than what they see on TV about what lawyers do. And you can sometimes pick up on those things the same way you would have picked up on them as a high school student touring a college campus when it was in session. You get a sense for what the community of learning is going to be.
That's really great advice. And if you're on a campus right now as an undergraduate where they have a law school, I bet you could just go stick your head in to a law school class every now and then.
Yeah, I think they generally have you jump through a few hoops, give your ID, and they generally ask the professor if they would permit it. But every time I've had a student go so far as to inquire, they've been able to find a class that they could sit in on. And it's been good.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. So how do you find it teaching undergraduates versus law students? I won't ask who are your favorites necessarily. But, how do you find working with the two different populations?
I'm teaching such a different topic to each of them. I get the privilege with undergraduates. For some of them, they've never really thought about how our legal system is set up the way it is or why it matters. They see the Constitution written hundreds of years ago. Why would that be relevant to my life if I'm planning on owning a business or, taking this career path? And I break it down and we talk about how the whole structure of our society is filled with ways in which the law impacts what you do as an individual, as a business person, as an employee, as an employer. So I really get to open the eyes of a lot of people who haven't thought about this legal environment that surrounds them. So that's fun.
And didn't I see on social media that you are really diving into the Constitution right now with your undergraduates as well, which has to be fascinating given the state of the world?
It's fascinating to me. I hope that it's fascinating to some of them. This semester, I have a very early class, so it's very hard to get college students fascinated by anything at 8:30 in the morning. But it's really
that is true.
A prime time to say, I can point to almost any page in their in the constitutional law section of their textbook, and we can find something that was headline news that week. Where people are talking about who should decide big issues, the states or the federal government, or which branch of government and what's the role. And so it makes it very relevant in a way that I think many of them thought it wasn't relevant. Most people think that the law is the law. Most students are surprised to learn that judges write opinions, and that is law, just like what the legislature puts into effect. They're surprised by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that I always found it interesting, too, how as history has changed, so does the law and the courts. The courts deciding that the times require some new law. So they just create something different. They abolish something. They create a new rule based on what's happening currently in the United States, culturally or politically. The fact that it lives and breathes and changes, I think, is something that I didn't really appreciate, I think, until I started studying the law itself.
Well, and I think that's great, too. I mean, we talk about, I'll ask them what they picture themselves doing 5 years from now and try then to show that, whatever path they think they're going to take to make a living, some part of the textbook that we're going to be working through is going to have a significant impact on what they're able to do and on the rules that their employer has to follow. And sometimes the law moves pretty quickly, and we talk about how there's been a big change that has happened since they started at college, and they're surprised to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. In law school, because they don't print the law books all that frequently, you get these packets that are usually like paper addendums that you may purchase, a supplement or an addendum to your casebook, that are the cases that just came out in the last year or two, that sometimes they haven't even been officially published, so they don't even have the true citation in them, that the law professors feel that they need to be teaching.
Yes, and then some professors never make it out of the 1700s.
That's true.
But there's value to that too, because sometimes an issue comes up that nobody's really thought about for a really long time, and it's part of our legal system, and we have to pull it out and dust it off and see what it tells us about what people can and can't do now.
Yeah.
I added a slide on the emoluments clause to my undergrad lecture, and I admit I had never spent any time thinking about it until this year, but it's something that lawyers will spend time thinking about now.
Yeah, as well as a lot of rights around immigration, what rights do, with the different, individual rights that somebody has as a citizen, as a visa holder, as an immigrant, as an illegal immigrant. I mean, it is amazing that any copy of the New York Times is just filled with constitutional issues.
Yes. And I think I get business students, a lot of them haven't thought about these issues. And I try to show them that understanding, so the way the system is set up is important, whichever way your political leanings go. It's important to understand what your arguments are for one conclusion and what your opponent might be arguing, and to think about them. I mean, the best students coming into law school have some experience with critical thinking, with not just reaching a conclusion, but asking, why do I think this, and where are the weaknesses of my position? And students that come out of undergrad with the ability to think critically about issues have a leg up in law school.
I think that that's a really good point. And a great example of that is the fact that in law school, and I'm not sure if the undergrad casebooks do this, but it's a big deal if they include a dissenting opinion in the casebook. And they oftentimes do, especially for Supreme Court cases. And many law professors will require you to understand what the dissenters said, as well as what the majority said. And I think in the beginning, you think, well, that's silly. The dissenting law isn't law, right? In most cases. But the the dissenting opinion can have a lot of interesting points. It can actually show you how different factual situations could get a different outcome. It can have you look forward at the future, and sometimes those dissenting opinions become the rule in the future as the courts start to change law, if the law warrants change. So it is interesting. I think you're right. It's this critical thinking. It's enjoying kind of getting into the language and really appreciating who these kind of cast of characters are, of Supreme Court justices and federal judges and state judges as well, depending on the class, and kind of this conversation they're having about things that really make a big difference in how many of us live our lives at various points.
Right.
But of course we like this because you and I are nerdy enough to want to spend all of our time reading and thinking about this stuff.
Yep.
So if you find this fascinating too, you should go to law school.
And one of the things that I really encourage students to do if they're thinking about law school is to spend a little bit of time trying to identify how you learn best. Because for the brightest student, the most well-prepared student will find law school. I've yet to find anyone who says law school wasn't challenging. I've found many people who did very well, who loved it, who enjoyed it, but I've never met anyone who said it was a breeze. Law school's challenging. Yeah. And one of the best things you can do if you're thinking about law school or thinking about any type of graduate study is to give a little thought now to what works for you, because we all learn differently. We all take in information in different ways and internalize it in a way that works for us. And the more you can identify what works for you. Do you study best alone? Do you need to write things down? Does it help you to listen to podcasts? Those type of pieces, the more you understand about how you learn, the better off you'll be when you are in a challenging learning situation.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point, coupled with your advice on visiting law school classes, reading some interesting books before you get ready to go to law school. Allison, and we'll link to these in the podcast, did a great series over on the Girls Guide to Law School about informational interviewing. And I think as an undergrad, it's a great time to try and meet lawyers and talk to them about what they do to make sure you want to go to law school. And informational interviewing can give you kind of a framework for that. But one of the best questions I think to ask lawyers when you're getting ready to go to law school is, what do you do every day? Because I think so often when you're thinking about having a career as a lawyer, you might think about the good wife and they're in trial every day or, intrigue or lots of fast moving, maybe exciting things that for most lawyers is not really how it goes. I mean, my dad still does litigation and, he was like, oh, the trial was continued again or this, it's not, right. Everything is actually kind of moves very slowly and the day-to-day work that you end up doing is not necessarily that fast-paced. And so talking to lawyers and really understanding what lawyers do as a day in the life, I think is very helpful in deciding if this is a path that interests you.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's also a good skill to learn just in the world today. This whole concept of informational interviewing, talking to someone to listen to what they have to say, as opposed to calling them up and saying, what can you do for me? If you can do a few informational interviews when you're ready to find a job in your chosen field, whether it's law or something else, you've learned some of the basics of networking because you've learned to listen.
That's very true.
Not just ask for something.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. And if you aren't really a fan of talking to people, you can also read biographies, which is something I like to do in my free time because I find different people's stories about their paths to be quite interesting. And different folks even talking about their transition to law school. And I just read another fascinating book that I will link to in the show notes that was talking about a young man who grew up in the Rust Belt and then he ends up at Yale Law School. And he talks a lot about what it was like to grow up in the Rust Belt, but then how you make this transition to go to a very elite law school and how that was kind of very much of a kind of culture shock to him. And I mean, it's fascinating stuff. If you're someone who is thinking, wow, if I go to one of these law schools, I have no idea what that experience is going to be like. It can be really helpful to read about other people's experiences. So that's another option if you don't feel like you have access to a lot of lawyers, is go to the library. Get access to
Good idea.
Yeah.
Good idea.
All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be just sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. New episodes are typically released on Monday. And don't forget to learn more about Start Law School Right at our course page, lawschooltoolbox.com/courses/join, including information on upcoming contests where you have an opportunity to win a free Start Law School Right Silver course package. You can also keep up to date with all our offerings on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/lawschooltoolbox. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. And you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. If you are thinking of starting law school in the fall, we recommend that you check out our Start Law School Right course, which is offered on demand anytime throughout the summer that can help you get ready for law school. And if you have any interest in talking to Keri about how she can help you in your legal journey, you're welcome to reach out to her through our website as well. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.